Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 10 August 2024. It is the 138th anniversary of the birth of Carl Stephenson, who was born in Fayette, Iowa on this date in 1886, probably. At least one source gave the date of his birth as 1888, so I may be off by a couple of years. Most of my library comes from used bookstores, which I've been visiting all my life. And one of my used bookstore finds many years ago was Carl Stephenson's Medieval Feudalism. I didn't know that this was a classic of the genre when I got it, and I didn't know anything about Stephenson. After I read the book, I didn't follow up on it, although even at the time, my younger self appreciated the clarity and concision of Stevenson's exposition of feudalism. The book is foundational in the sense of taking a foundational concept, feudalism, and subjecting that concept to inquiry and analysis. It's often the case that the foundational concepts we employ are poorly understood, and as a result, their use can be vague, which leads to further confusion. A short, concise book on a foundational concept can go a long way toward clarification, and Stevenson's Medieval Feudalism provided some of this clarification, illuminating medieval civilization entire in doing so. Stevenson himself indirectly disavowed larger ambitions in the preface of the book. Quote, "In the following pages, I have tried to explain as simply and concisely as possible the historical significance of the feudal system. Despite the obvious importance of the subject, there's been almost no general treatment of it in English to supply the brief statements of the ordinary textbooks. My purpose has not been to give a comprehensive description of Europe in the feudal age or even of feudal society. I have taken for granted that the reader will be familiar with the main political events of the Middle Ages, the barbarian invasions, the formation of the Carolingian Empire, the establishment of the later monarchies, the Crusades, and the like. I have omitted all but cursory mention of the manorial system and the revival of commerce, admirable sketches of which have already been published. I have, in other words, restricted the discussion to the few institutions that may be said to have constituted feudalism proper, or to have been peculiarly associated with it," unquote. So he's not saying he's going to give you the big picture of medieval society, but as I said previously, when you address a foundational concept like feudalism, foundationalism to the Middle Ages, it's going to clarify everything else around it. So we could say it's a demonstration of the power of general concepts, especially those that are foundational within a given scholarly milieu, that their clarification can inform the clarification of a discipline. Foundational clarification clarifies everything else around that foundation, that rests on that foundation. Many years after reading Stevenson's Medieval Feudalism, not long ago, in fact, I received by interlibrary loan a copy of Methods in Social Science, a casebook edited by Stuart A. Rice and published in 1931. I had ordered this volume for the paper by Henri Pirenne, which includes What Are Historians Trying to Do?, which was included in an excerpted and abridged form in Hans Meyerhoff's anthology, Philosophy of History in Our Time, which I recently mentioned several times in my episode on Karl Popper in relation to historicism. It turned out that another paper in the volume I had received by interlibrary loan, the work of Henri Pirenne and Georg von Bülow, with respect to the origin of the medieval town by Stevenson, gave me a lot to think about. At first, the name of the author didn't ring a bell with me, but eventually I made the connection with the author of Medieval Feudalism. Stevenson notes at the beginning of this paper that, quote, 100 years ago, historians still glibly asserted the persistence of Roman municipal institutions, unquote. Despite the many footnotes to the paper, most of which are references to German papers with a smattering of French and English works, this particular claim is not footnoted and is presented as though it were common knowledge at the time. And perhaps it was. I wonder who the historians were in the early 19th century who regarded the persistence of Roman municipal institutions as being common knowledge. I haven't been able to find the sources of this view, which Stephenson said was commonplace a century before his time. The continuity of Roman institutions through late antiquity and into the early medieval period constitutes even today a bone of contention. But that isn't what interested me about the paper. Stephenson compares the views of 5 historians and their theories of the origins of medieval cities, and then he gives a list of properties which could be said to be the differentia between villages and cities. These properties include 1, having a market, 2, being walled, 3, constituting a jurisdictional unit, and 4, enjoying special dispensation with regard to fiscal, military, and other political responsibilities. After naming these 4 differentia, Stephenson adds, quote, all 4 of these characteristics were matters of public law, for they came by virtue of state endowment, unquote. We can count this as a 5th differentia, and I will come back to it. After outlining the state of the debate over medieval cities in the late 19th century, Stephenson introduces Pirenne and his ideas, which focus on the city as a locus of trade and the emergence of a distinct mercantile class involved in trade. These 2 characteristics, trade and a trading class, which I guess could be thought of as 1 or 2 characteristics, as you please, can be added to the list I gave previously. So now we have 6 or 7 characteristics as the differentia of a village from a city. Having a market might be considered to be the same as being a center of commerce, and there is some discussion of that in the paper. Even in the Middle Ages, there were small markets. I should say, even in the early Middle Ages, there were small markets, but these markets were insufficiently large to support and sustain a distinct mercantile class. So one might consider the emergence of such a class of merchants more distinctive than the existence of trade per se. In Stephenson and the scholars he cites, the emergence of cities in medieval Europe is treated as something new in history. Stephenson writes in terms of, quote, the beginnings of urban life in Europe, while Pirenne, in his famous work, Medieval Cities, wrote, the birth of cities, quote, the birth of cities marked the beginning of a new era in the internal history of Western Europe, unquote. That's the final, the first sentence of the final chapter in Pirenne's Medieval Cities. Of course, we know that cities are certainly not new to history, and Stephenson said it was formerly a commonplace that Roman municipal institutions survived from classical antiquity. Cities were not new to history and not new to Europe, but they were new to the civilization of medieval Europe that was then in the process of development. Europe had essentially lost its Roman cities. Some cities were simply abandoned, while other cities had ceased to function as cities, although they remained as settlements, often much reduced in size. When the civilization of medieval Europe began to reestablish commerce, cities began to appear, some of them at the sites of former ancient cities, and some of them founded de novo. Western civilization passed through a distinctive and perhaps a unique stage of development in the early Middle Ages. Formerly, we called this the Dark Ages, except historians don't use that term very often anymore. During the early Middle Ages, or during the Dark Ages, cities that had been depopulated in the late Roman period declined further into mere ruins with an adjacent village. Rome itself declined from a peak of around 1 million persons down to a few thousand residents. Some historians put the number at 50,000, some put the number at less than 30,000. It's obvious that once a built-up area had largely returned to an agricultural use, with the decline of Rome from a city of 1 million to a city of less than 50,000. Because we know that statues like the Laocoon group were dug up in gardens and vineyards that had been planted long after the structures of the built environment had been forgotten. Statues that were once placed in some wealthy Roman citizen's garden were literally plowed up centuries later. During the Dark Ages, which is a term I continue to use, there were fortresses, administrative centers, churches, and monasteries, but few, if any, proper cities in Western Europe. Many of these institutions, fortresses and monasteries, for example, had adjacent villages, but according to Pirenne and Stephenson, and to most other scholars at the time, a castle plus a village does not a city make. The royal court at the time was essentially nomadic, moving from one castle to another, or from one military campaign to another, without settling down in one place for a period of time sufficient to attract the kind of population that would turn some administrative center into a city. Above all, there were manorial estates ruled by a feudal lord who had sworn his loyalty to the crown, but who, for all practical purposes, was the unquestioned ruler within his domain. It's interesting that Stephenson had so little to say about manorial estates, as I would maintain that this was the fundamental unit of medieval civilization in the early Middle Ages, along with monasteries. And this is what made early medieval civilization so distinctive, so different from other civilizations, and so different from its classical ancestor. Instead of civilization being based on a network of city, as in the ancient world or the modern world, early medieval civilization was based on a loose network of manorial estates. This manorial structure is a distinct kind of civilization that constitutes a distinct period within the larger history of Western civilization. By invoking Western civilization, I am implicitly relying on a more abstract conception of civilization, that is to say, civilization at a higher level than the kind of abstraction involved in the concept of, say, medieval European civilization, or indeed of a manorially based civilization of the early Middle Ages. In a less abstract conception of civilization, the civilization of classical antiquity came to an end, and the civilization of medieval Europe began to form, the latter following the former, influenced by it, but by the same time distinct from it. When we posit a construction like Western civilization, we are talking about a different kind of civilization than the kind of civilization that classical antiquity constituted on its own, apart from what came before and apart from what followed it. Or for that matter, different from what we're talking about when we talk about modern civilization in relation to what came before, what will come after, or medieval civilization on the whole, which is medieval, the age between other ages, the age between antiquity and modernity. The implied continuities that make Western civilization into one great entity comprising ancient, medieval, and modern civilizations around the Mediterranean, Europe, and eventually the New World are not continuities of administration, not continuities of political regimes or institutions, not even, according to Pirenne and Stephenson, continuities of cities and the institutions based in cities. We could call it the continuity of a great tradition, to use the terminology of Robert Redfield, but even here, the great tradition has changed over historical time. In particular, the three great divisions of Western civilization, ancient, medieval, and modern, each had a distinct great tradition, though there was also dissent with modification of this tradition handed down in an altered form over thousands of years. One of the fundamental changes over the history of Western civilization was the role that cities played as the centers of the great tradition of civilization. This is one reason I found myself so intrigued by Stevenson's list of 4 or 5 characteristics that distinguish a village from a city. The problem of medieval history reflects a later discussion of the origins of pristine civilizations at the very origins of civilization. The standard by which we naturally measure theories of urbanization is V. Gordon Child's 1950 paper, The Urban Revolution, which was published in the Town Planning Review. Child's paper dates from a couple of decades after the debates discussed by Stevenson in the 30s. Child, too, wanted to distinguish a village from a city, but he wanted to distinguish a Neolithic village from a Neolithic city, while Stevenson wanted to distinguish a medieval village, which may well have be co-located with a now defunct ancient city from a medieval city. Child had also produced a list of characteristics which he said were diagnostic of an early revolution in the ancient world. His list consisted of 10 items, including 1, the extent and density of settlements, 2, division of labor, that is to say, craft specialization, 3, surplus valued transferred to social elites, which could also be called capital accumulation or capital formation, monumental architecture, 5, social stratification, 6, writing, 7, science, 8, art, 9, trade, and 10, prioritizing residence over kinship. Of these 10 items on Child's list, the only one shared by Stevenson's list is trade. Child's list of 10 characteristics of a city has been enormously influential, and it continues to be influential today. Moreover, it has expanded beyond diagnostic criteria for an urban revolution to commonly being used by archaeologists as diagnostic for civilization. What this means is that later scholars are continuously revising the list of characteristics, and while there's no settled consensus, at least there's a common conceptual framework within which shared problems can be discussed. But Child was a prehistorian and an archaeologist, not a historian like Stevenson. His interest was in the foundation of pristine cities, that is to say, cities that appeared where no city had previously existed. And this makes Child's conceptual framework for ancient urbanization distinct from Stevenson's conceptual framework for medieval urbanization. In a sense, Child's list of urban's characteristics has functioned as a framework for the discussion of the emergence of civilization, much as the Drake equation has functioned as a framework for the discussion of extraterrestrial intelligence and its ability to communicate with us or to us. If we could quantify Child's 10 criteria for the urban revolution, we could formulate the Child equation analogous to the Drake equation, and we could use the Child equation to retrodict the presence of a civilization in the past. Retrodiction being the logical operation analogous to prediction, but while prediction predicts the future, retrodiction predicts the past. Or retrodicts the past, I should say. Stevenson and Purin were engaged in a similar project, although under distinct historical conditions. As I said, V. Gordon Child was interested in the earliest formation of the earliest cities. Stevenson and Purin were interested in the formation of medieval cities. The first 4 characteristics or criteria introduced by Stevenson were, as he said, matters of public law that came by virtue of state endowment. That cities could arise in this environment immediately distinguishes medieval cities from the emergence of ancient cities. The ancient cities that arose in the earliest history of civilization, and indeed which cities constituted the earliest history of civilization, could not have arisen by virtue of state endowment because there was no state at that time. But while the medieval state was weak and often ineffectual, because because many of the fictions of Roman law and classical antiquity were maintained well into the Middle Ages, this fiction could always be drawn upon to impart a legal basis for a city. Despite the pervasive idea diffusion from that earlier civilization, medieval civilization often could not, in many cases, make use of Roman ideas in any practical way, because the political, social, and economic environment had changed so radically. Thus, ideas too became symbols. One could even say they became mere symbols. Roman symbols, retained or revived without the institutions they symbolized, were invoked for reasons of prestige and not for reasons of efficacy of governance. The grandeur that was Rome was always a convenient symbol for imperialism, but no less important was the great antiquity of the tradition. For medieval man, and for almost all pre-modern peoples, to be ancient is to be closer to the truth, because the truth is to be found at the origins of things, and the origins of things lie in the distant past, often the past that is lost in myth and legend. If, through the use of Roman symbols, you can demonstrate that your regime is connected to the earliest known period of history, and preferably that your power dates to the very foundation of the world, then your legitimacy has been established over and above any later regimes. In this context, new developments would always be rationalized in terms of earlier states of affairs. And new developments always were occurring in medieval civilization, no less than in ancient or modern civilization. One of these new developments was the reappearance of cities in medieval Europe and of the commerce that sustained them after centuries of absence. The period of medieval urbanization that began in the 10th century, which Pirenne and others called the revival of the towns, could be called the second urbanization of Europe. The first urbanization of Europe was the Roman urbanization. Prior to the Roman urbanization of Europe, there were agricultural settlements, but no significant cities. With the collapse of Roman institutions, most Roman cities failed, and those that survived lost population, institutions, and complexity. Turenne describes it like this in medieval cities. Quote, "The period which opened with the Carolingian era knew cities neither in the social sense, nor in the economic sense, nor in the legal sense of that word. The towns and the burghs were merely fortified places and headquarters of administration. Their inhabitants enjoyed neither special laws nor institutions of their own, and their manner of living did not distinguish them in any way from the rest of society. Commercial and industrial activity were completely foreign to them. In no respect were they out of key with the agricultural civilization of their times," unquote. After hundreds of years of cities and commerce playing a marginal role in Western history, cities began to revive and new cities were founded. It is this medieval urbanization of Europe starting in the 10th century that I suggested we could call the second urbanization of Europe. I've taken this term, second urbanization, from the history of the Indian subcontinent, where there was a major civilization, the Indus Valley civilization, in early prehistory that was subsequently lost to all memory. After the Indus Valley civilization had been forgotten, India eventually gave rise to another civilization, which we could call Vedic civilization, and the network of cities of this later civilization is called the second urbanization. Are there parallels between the second urbanization of India and the second urbanization of Europe? Of course, there are analogies that hold and there are analogies that fail. What I want to focus on here is the structural similarity in the histories, the parallelism of urban development, where some analogies between Europe and India hold and some fail, but the parallelism of a second urbanization remains. We can formulate second urbanization as a general concept by decoupling it from the specific circumstances of ancient India and medieval Europe. In this way, we could apply this concept of second urbanization to, for example, Mesoamerica, which had been repeatedly urbanized by the pre-Columbian civilizations of Mesoamerica, the most intensely urban of which was the Mayan. But that had almost entirely collapsed by the time the Spanish arrived in the New World. The Spanish urbanization of Mesoamerica is the second urbanization of Mesoamerica. There are, it seems, two implicit conditions of the concept of second urbanization. One, that the urbanization is not a pristine urbanization, but that two, the previous urbanization has completely lapsed, and that much of the social complexity was lost in the earlier de-urbanization. So what about third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and so on iterations of urbanizations? If we've got second urbanization, what about third urbanization? What do we call the nth iteration of urbanization? To arrive at an even more generic concept, we can further generalize this concept away from the second urbanizations of India and Europe and Mesoamerica and apply this concept to any circumstance where an earlier and perhaps pristine urbanization has failed and a later urbanization has succeeded it. We could call this iterated urbanization. This is an instructive moment for concept formation in history. Concepts introduced as apparently parochial descriptors can be repurposed in a more theoretical history. Second urbanization was introduced to describe what happened on the Indian subcontinent, but it is applicable elsewhere in other parts of the world. That is to say, concepts that develop from an ideographic concept, let me repeat that, concepts can develop from an ideographic concept toward a more nomothetic concept, from the particularistic to the universalistic. This is one of the mechanisms by which we can lift history out of its ideographic ghetto and raise it up to be something closer to theoretical history. If we can do this with foundational concepts like feudalism, then all so much the better. When the foundational concepts of history are theoretical concepts, then we have the beginnings of a theoretical framework in place, which can be supplemented by observational concepts, and now historical thought is closer to the practice of the theoretical sciences. So happy birthday, Carl Stephenson, and thanks for listening.